Death on the Nile was released in 2022 and was directed by and stars Kenneth Branagh in his second portrayal of Hercule Poirot. While in Egypt, Poirot is tasked with solving a murder that takes place on board the Karnak, a paddle steamer on the Nile River. As the bodies begin to pile up, the pressure only increases for him to figure out who done it. I reviewed the 1978 adaptation of Death on the Nile a little while ago, and ever since then I've been looking forward to seeing this newest take on the story. And my thoughts on it are definitely mixed. There are some aspects to this movie that I really liked, and some I really did not, and I will explain all of those as we go along. Just a warning, I'm going to be completely spoiling this movie, as I think that's probably the best way to discuss it in comparison to the earlier version. For a start, the film opens in a way I was not expecting. On the battlefield, in some trenches occupied by the Belgian army during the First World War. The origins of Hercule Poirot have always been vague, intentionally, but this film attempts to build something of a backstory for him. The idea of that I actually like a lot, in large part because it reminded me of the opening of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. That film began in Indy's childhood, and in short order set up the origins of his fear of snakes, the bullwhip, most importantly his fedora. When I say that I like the idea of this backstory for Poirot, please understand I mean the backstory for this iteration of the character. I don't take this as changing anything for the literary character. This film uses the war-torn scene to set up Poirot's mustache, which he apparently grew to cover a fairly large scar on his upper lip, at the behest of his fiancée. To be honest, I found that all a little strange. I'm okay with Poirot having a noticeable, grand mustache just because he's vain. But this idea all plays into the movie's attempt to turn Poirot into something he's really not typically. A tortured hero. I've never seen Poirot that way in my mind. He isn't someone that would spend decades solving crimes just to keep himself busy, because inside he's filled with regrets and guilt over the death of the woman he loved. And this film hints at that. I don't think the movie needed that angle, and when it keeps coming back to that, it just felt kind of shoehorned in. But getting back to the opening, I really love the look of it. It's gorgeously shot in black and white, and those shots on the field of battle are so stark and crisp looking. Honestly, it made me wish the whole movie had been filmed in black and white, partly because of the abundance of CGI backdrops that we're treated to later on, but I'll talk more about that in a little bit. We're also briefly introduced to Poirot's captain in the army, the man who apparently sported the mustache that Poirot emulated once he grew his own. And let's talk about that mustache. I seem to remember that feature of Kenneth Branagh's depiction of Poirot being talked about a lot back when Murder on the Orient Express first came out. The main thing was the size of it, and the particularly grandiose shape it took. I actually don't mind it at all. I'm pretty certain it's mentioned in the books that Poirot has the most magnificent mustaches in all the world, or in all of Europe, probably both. And the designer of this mustache took that to heart. In Death on the Nile, it has changed somewhat, and it literally looks like more than one mustache, resembling to me a pair of birds taking flight. If nothing else, this is the biggest visual difference between Branagh's interpretation of the character compared to everyone else's. The fact that it's covering a scar, though, I'm not sure how that works exactly. The scar issue seems to be pretty extensive, and nothing is mentioned about how the rest of his face healed so nicely. When we are first shown his disfigured face, about half of his cheek looks to have been blown away. But that area doesn't show any trace of lasting damage once we flash forward to 1937. And in 1937, Poirot is now the renowned detective we all know and love, and he's given a nice introduction, demonstrating his predilection for symmetry when being served a variety of desserts. This might be an unpopular opinion, but in general, I quite like Kenneth Branagh's portrayal of the character. He's nowhere near my favorite, but he is such a great actor, and he's interesting to watch. I have to say, I was not expecting the humor that has been liberally sprinkled throughout this film, and most of it comes from Poirot. The way Branagh delivers those comedic lines is so different from the rest of his portrayal, though, so in a way it feels out of character. He almost mumbles some of the comments, or just gently says them, whereas if he's questioning someone or speaking about his own well-deserved fame, he is full of confidence and commands attention. Some of the humor feels very calculated, and some of it feels too modern, but overall, it worked for me. I think it was better to go that way than sticking with being a very dour character. We get some of that as well, but this helped to balance it out. In contrast to Peter Ustinov's humorous side, that usually comes out much more spontaneously and can take me by surprise. And Branagh's felt like you knew when a joke was coming. But again, I still found myself liking it. The structure and pacing of this movie are a lot different from the 1978 version, and that's where the runtime comes into play. This movie is by no means short, it's over 2 hours, but the earlier film is about 15 minutes longer. The 1978 version was very deliberately paced and used the first section of the film to set up everyone's motives and relationships with Lynette Ridgway. And that was definitely the better choice. Because you go into the murder basically understanding who everyone is and you feel like you know them to a degree. And then, once the bodies start dropping and the investigation gets underway, you can see all these character dynamics play out. And the interrogations can be used to demonstrate all the possible scenarios that could have happened. In the 2022 film, by the time we get to the murder, all we basically have is a long list of pretty thinly sketched characters. We know a couple possible motives, but here, the interrogation scenes are mainly used to discover motive, and it results in you not caring nearly as much. The feeling that you don't know the characters never really changes, and it made me wonder how that's possible. There was definitely enough time to build a group of believable characters with varying degrees of depth to them, but somehow they missed the mark. One big difference as well is that the group of guests on the Karnak, this time, are all wedding guests for Lynette and Simon, and they've invited them all. Last time I'm pretty sure they were mostly just other tourists, although many of them have connections to Lynette or the Ridgway family. If this time these are all invited guests, I'm really not sure why some of them are even invited, but I'll get to that as well. So about these characters, Kenneth Branagh is going for that old school, all-star cast feeling. And in comparison to their counterparts in 1978, you know this movie is going to come up short. I tried my best to not compare the performances while watching and just take these actors as they are, but I couldn't really help it. The actress featured most prominently on the posters, and ostensibly the second lead, is Gal Gadot, playing Lynette Ridgway. And I was not impressed. I think she can work in movies in a very specific mode, and this isn't it. Early on when we first meet her, she's fine, but she's mainly just smiling and being stared at by crowds of people. Later on, when she's meeting with Poirot to confide in him, or screaming at her husband while on the boat, you can see the limits of her acting range. Armie Hammer 2 was okay, but again, nothing spectacular. He goes missing from the movie for some lengthy sections, and I'm wondering if some of his screen time was cut with the various controversies surrounding him. I don't know that for a fact, but I almost wonder if scenes were left out because they contain too much of him, and he's no longer a selling point for the movie. But then, if there are other characters involved in those scenes, you lose some of their character development as well. Again, this is all guessing on my part, but I'm trying to figure out why this movie didn't work better than it did. Emma Mackey, though, was quite good, I thought, as Jacqueline de Belfort. It's a very different take on the character in comparison to Mia Farrow, and while I think Mia Farrow was much better, this character was more of a standout than a lot of others this time around. Her version seems much more devious, whereas Mia Farrow was more fragile and unstable. This one is more visibly scheming. Mia Farrow's take felt creepier, showing up and following the newlyweds around while on their honeymoon. Leslie Hope as well was great, and I think is quite comparable to Jane Birkin's performance as the French maid to Lynette. She is given a little hint of having the love of jewelry that Bette Davis had last time. The discovery of her body is handled differently, but I actually like that change. They're obviously trying to heighten the drama, so finding her spinning along on the paddle wheel was quite an unsettling visual. Russell Brand plays the doctor on board, which is a necessary character, but what was strange is that he is Lynette Ridgway's ex-fiancé, so what he's doing at their wedding I have no idea, and why he would even come along on the Karnak I don't understand. He and Gal Gadot share hardly any screen time, so why the decision to add that to his character was made, I don't know. Character's rationale aside, I think he was alright, but like so many others, doesn't have a lot to do in the movie, so it was hard to form much of an impression. His best moment might have been while examining the body of Lynette after her murder is discovered. He plays the emotion of a man still very much in love with her very well. Letitia Wright was pretty good. She gets a quite forceful scene where she's telling off Poirot after she discovers he was investigating her prior to the murder being committed. Ali Fazal plays Cachadorian, Lynette's cousin, updated from George Kennedy's lawyer character of Andrew Pennington. That character was basically squandered this time around. I thought the motives in attempting to cover up his embezzling were so much better told in the earlier film. Here, we know almost nothing about him before he's quickly trying to get Lynette to sign all the paperwork when they're first on board. That scene was not very well handled in general. With the ending of this story still fairly fresh in my mind, I thought Armie Hammer especially was playing the villainous side of his character a little too obviously at this point in the story. I think Simon McCorkindale had a much better handle on the subtlety of the character in that scene. I think I enjoyed Annette Bening. Again, I'm having a hard time remembering what she actually did in the movie, but she plays the mother of Tom Bateman's character Book, returning after Murder on the Orient Express. I have not seen that film since it first came out, so I may have to double back and rewatch that soon, because I am hard-pressed to remember what he all had to do in that film. I did like him in general in this movie. He's a fun character and gets to be Poirot's ally in the investigation. I typically enjoy the characters that are partnered with Poirot in any iteration of these stories, because it's fun watching a quote-unquote normal person reacting to Poirot's little foibles and fussy ways. I was quite surprised that it's Book that is killed right in front of Poirot late in the movie, but I enjoyed them having a similar scene as Angela Lansbury had in the '78 version. And speaking of Angela Lansbury, her character has been revamped from an author to a blues singer, played by Sophie Okonedo. This character is quite important to this film, as one of the major changes to the story is that Poirot has a love interest. He very quickly becomes smitten with her, to the point that he begins babbling when she speaks with him. That scene of him stammering and becoming very awkward was odd to say the least, and the only thing I liked about it was the references to his love of growing the vegetable marrows, as he says, which he most famously retires to take up in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. Is that the next novel Kenneth Branagh is potentially looking at adapting? Who knows? My thoughts on his possible retirement and the ties to the Mrs. Otterbourne character are all tied up in the ending, which I'll talk about at the end of this review. I mentioned the scene in the salon where Armie Hammer was a little too obvious in his intentions with wanting the new will signed, and I had that feeling as well when he and Emma Mackey are having the argument that ends with her shooting him. Again, maybe it's just a case of knowing where this story is headed, but I really got the feeling the characters are playing it up too much for the bystanders. Had I not known, perhaps I would have missed that. And maybe it's just me, but the moment where she shoots him felt really awkwardly edited. My only guess is that they're editing around the fact that he is squeezing a paint-laden handkerchief to his leg, so they won't be using a squib for the movie, instead being a series of quick cuts capturing the other passengers' reactions and then cutting to Simon lying on the couch moaning. It feels like a nitpick, but it is a crucial scene, and if I didn't know what was going on, I'm still not sure if I would have been convinced. Also, I have to mention, there was some ridiculously risque dance sequences in this film. I have no idea why they were there. There are far tamer ways to depict the attraction between these characters. I can't imagine anyone in so-called polite society would have been putting on a display like that in public, especially in the 1930s. Okay, now for some positives. I really love the cinematography in the film. Like the character he is playing, Kenneth Branagh, the director, seems to have a great love of symmetry, demonstrated in so many shots throughout the movie. The shot where we first see Poirot in Egypt, attempting to enjoy his breakfast in front of the pyramids, was just beautiful, but that takes me to the special effects. Those CGI backgrounds are almost incredibly unconvincing, and the scene where Poirot is reunited with Book on the pyramid was maybe the worst of the bunch. Normally that type of thing can take me out of the movie completely, but the reason I didn't mind this time was partly the time period of the movie and the setting. The whole thing reminded me of a 1940s studio-bound film, where we're supposed to be on an exotic cruise or a train ride, but the rear projection is not fooling anyone. Which is why I think this movie could have been better if it were entirely in black and white. That feel of a glossy Hollywood production where they never left the lot is kind of fun, with the cuts from scenes on the boat to very obvious second unit photography in Egypt. And if it were all in black and white, I think the CGI would not have stood out nearly so much. Not all of it is bad, There's a shot of the whole group in the bow of the Karnak that looked great, and the scenes by the massive statues looked good as well. I believe they built huge replicas of them. Again, Alfred Hitchcock himself preferred to stay in the studio as much as possible, which is how we got Cary Grant climbing around on a studio recreated version of Mount Rushmore. The sets in this movie are excellent and opulent. In particular, the Cataract Hotel, where the group of passengers first meet. The halls are grand and full of detail, and it's all so well lit. Kenneth Branagh films these locations masterfully, and you can tell he loves changing up the angles and giving us interesting shot compositions. Similarly on the Karnak, I really love the exterior of it and the salon area at the front of the boat, which is comprised of almost all windows. He shoots from outside through all these windows, and we see the characters' faces split amongst all the various surfaces and panes of glass. There's a scene where Poirot and Bouc are talking in two giant wicker chairs, and he films from behind them. And when he pushes in for a close-up, you can see their faces obscured through the woven pattern, almost giving the impression of a confessional booth, which is fitting with what their conversation entails. The interior of the cabins and the dining area on the Karnak, I wasn't too crazy about. It's all pretty much monochromatic in various shades of silver and gray, and felt pretty bland. Again, shoot it in black and white and we'd never know, but I did prefer the more wood-paneled look of the Karnak in 1978. The boat as a whole feels much larger, but we don't get a great sense of the layout. I mentioned in my 78 review that the geography was established so well, because it's crucial to knowing where everyone is and how they could have navigated the boat unseen by others. Here, we basically don't need to know it, so they don't bother to show us. Something I kind of like, and many other people likely don't, is they toy with the idea of making Poirot something of an action hero. I'm pretty sure they did the same thing in Branagh's last Poirot film. I seem to remember him clambering around on a trestle bridge that the Orient Express stops on, chasing someone, I believe. But this time, he takes off in pursuit of Bouc's killer after he is shot. The killer shoots at him, Poirot is diving for the floor, eventually recovering the gun. Would the beloved character from the books ever be seen doing such a thing? No. But in fairness, we've already had many portrayals that are more accurate, and they still exist. We can watch those whenever. So if Kenneth Branagh wants to make Poirot into a slightly more energetic man, striding the decks, brandishing a .45, I say go for it. However, if we see him engaged in some sort of martial arts fight sequence in a later film, then we might just have gone too far. The resolution to the mystery was okay. It felt a little rushed to me, but it ends again with the deaths of Simon and Jacqueline. The choice to have them die sort of standing up looked strange, but before that, I thought Kenneth Branagh was great in the whole scene. He's filled with anger at the death of Bouc, and his delivery of the monologue where he explains what happened was excellent. And now we come to the ending of the film. We flash forward 6 months to London. I love the transition from the Nile to the Thames, by the way. And Hercule Poirot has sought out Mrs. Otterbourne, who is performing a song. He takes his seat at the table, turns to face the camera, and there it is. He has shaved off his mustache, and we now see the huge scar he has been hiding for the last couple decades. And my reaction, as well as the group I was watching this movie with, was, what? Apparently, this mustache has been a huge burden he's been carrying around since the death of his fiancée. And now that he has found someone else, he was able to move on and leave it behind. It was almost like a symbolic removal of a wedding band or something like that, and it just fell flat to me. I don't know what we're supposed to take away from that. Has he retired from being a detective? I'm not sure. But the ending was definitely a sour note to leave us on. And it makes me wonder if the writer of the screenplay, Michael Green, and Kenneth Branagh really understand this character, because trying to add some deeper emotional meaning to him by way of the symbolism of his mustache feels like they missed the point. I feel like this review doesn't accurately convey how I felt in the midst of watching this movie, because while watching it, I was enjoying it quite a bit, and I will say it is an entertaining movie, and it was mostly afterwards, while reflecting and comparing, that the many issues popped up for me. If you've never seen the 1978 version, this movie would likely be much better, because without a doubt, the earlier film is better in every way. The cast, the portrayal of the characters, the suspense. If you want the superior take on this story, the choice is obvious. But still, I'm sure I will watch this movie again someday. Kenneth Branagh is basically the whole show, along with the cinematography. I forgot to mention, the score as well I really liked, by Patrick Doyle. Some of those exotic stylings during the establishing shots in Egypt were very nice. So would I recommend the 2022 version of Death on the Nile? I would for some people, with the many caveats I've listed in mind. I think most people will know before going in whether they are in the mood to enjoy it. It's by no means a classic, but it was a fun watch, and I would definitely be fine with Kenneth Branagh continuing this series, no matter how unlikely that seems, if for no other reason than to see what he has in mind for this character next. Thanks for watching my review. If you enjoyed it, please head on over to my channel, Hildebrand Productions. Adios for now.